Chapter 15, Battle in California. The nasty weather that had assaulted Seattle since the previous October finally broke. On April 2nd, a warm sun blossomed over Lake Washington. Students emerged from the mustiness of the library and the dankness of their rented rooms. At the Shell House, the crew boys stripped off their jerseys and stretched out on the ramp, basking in the sun. Jo figured a day out in the water would be good for Joyce. Her hatred for the job at the judge's house was growing with each passing day. She needed a break, so they rented a canoe and Jo paddled them briskly across the Montlang Cut. He made his way lazily among the green expanse of lily pads and beaver lodges on the south side of Union Bay until he found a spot he liked. Then he let the boat drift. Joyce reclined in the bow, trailing a hand in the water, soaking up the sun. Jo stretched out as best as he could in the stern and gazed up into the blue sky. From time to time, a frog croaked and plopped into the water. Blue dragonflies hovered overhead. Their wings rattled dryly. After a while, Jo took his guitar out of its battered old case and began to sing. At first, he sang the songs he and Joyce had sung on the school bus back in Sequim, funny, happy-go-lucky songs that made them both laugh. Then Jo slipped into soft, slow, sweet love songs, and Joyce grew quiet, watching him and listening, happy in a different, deeper way. When Jo stopped playing, they talked about what it would be like when they were married and had a home and maybe kids. They talked all afternoon, with no sense of time passing, until the chill of evening finally sent them paddling back to the university side of the bay. It was a day that both of them would remember well into old age. The next day, Jo, still feeling good after his day with Joyce, bought a little gas and drove over to the bakery where his father worked as a mechanic. He rolled the window down and waited, trying to enjoy the smell of baking bread but too nervous to really savor it. A little after noon, men dressed in white streamed out of the building and began sitting on the lawn, opening lunch boxes. Then a few men in dark coveralls emerged. Jo spotted his father immediately. At 6'2", he was easily the tallest man in the group. Jo climbed out of the car and trotted across the street. Harry looked up, saw him coming, and froze in place, clutching his lunchbox. Jo stuck out his hand and said, "Hey, Pop." Startled, Harry said nothing but took his son's hand. It had been 5.5 years since he'd seen Jo. He was no longer the scrawny kid that he had left behind in Sequim. Harry had to wonder what Jo was doing there. Had his son come to confront him or forgive him? "Hi, Jo," he said slowly. "It's swell to see you." The two of them crossed the street and climbed into the front of Jo's car. Harry unwrapped a salami sandwich and silently offered a half of it to Jo. They began to eat, and then, after a long, awkward silence, to talk. Harry spoke about the machinery and equipment in the bakery, and Jo said little at first. He wasn't much interested in the machinery, just happy to be hearing the sound of his father's big, deep, familiar voice. When Jo finally started to talk, questions about his half-siblings tumbled out. How is Harry Jr. doing? How is Mike now? How are the girls getting on? Harry assured him they were all well. There was a long pause. Jo asked if he could come by and see them. Harry looked down at his lap and said, "I don't reckon so, Jo." Deep down in Jo's gut, something surged. Anger, disappointment, resentment. He couldn't quite place the emotion, but it was old and familiar and painful. But then, without looking up, Harry added, "Sometimes Thule and I go off on little excursions, though. Nobody home but the kids then." In early April, the Pacific Coast Regatta was approaching. This year, the Washington cruise would face California on its own waters. As the day of the race grew nearer, Jo and the boys could not seem to hold on to their magic. One day they'd have it, the next day they'd lose it. They would beat the junior varsity on Monday, lose badly on Tuesday, win again on Wednesday, lose on Thursday. There was no clear favorite in the competition for the first boat, but Ulbrichsen had to make a decision. Finally, he placed his faith into the sophomores and made them the 1935 first varsity crew. The local newspapers announced it to the world. The sophomores promptly lost their next head-to-head race against the JV boat. Once again, Ulbrichsen changed his mind. He declared that the two boats would race one more time on the Oakland estuary a few days before the regatta. The winning boat would row as the varsity. On April 10th, after the team traveled down to California, Ulbrichtsen staged the race. Joe and his sophomore crewmates came in almost a length behind the JV. The sophomores slumped in their shell in disbelief. The JV had won the right to row as varsity, yet Ulbrichtsen still hesitated. The sophomores had come south with a new shell, and they did not like it. They had been complaining since they arrived that it just didn't swing for them. So Ulbrichtsen sent them out again in their old shell, the City of Seattle. This time they rowed beautifully and matched the JV's time. After a team dinner at the Hotel Oakland that night, Ulbrichtsen dropped the bomb on the JV. He told them he was going to race the sophomores as the varsity despite their repeated defeats. "I'm sorry," he said. "I probably shouldn't do this, but I can't help it." The JV boys walked out of the room in a rage. When reporters asked Ulbrichtsen about the series of reversals, he said simply what he believed in his heart about the sophomores. They were, he declared, possibly the best crew I have ever coached. Race day, April 13th, was rainy, and a stiff headwind blew out of the south, up the length of the Oakland estuary. The estuary was not a pretty place to row. Crumbling brick warehouses, oil storage tanks, rusting cranes, and gritty factories lined both sides of the waterway. The water itself was gray-green and oil-slicked. Right next to Cal's shell house, a 4-inch pipe discharged raw sewage directly into the estuary. By mid-afternoon, nearly 40,000 spectators had assembled. They gathered under umbrellas in empty lots, on scattered docks, on warehouse rooftops, and on small craft moored along the racecourse. At the finish line on the Fruitvale Avenue Bridge, thousands of California fans in blue and gold mingled with hundreds of Washington loyalists in purple and gold. Everyone was jostling to get a good view of the water. The freshman race went off first, with Washington stroke Don Hume easily powering the boat to a 3-length victory over Cal. The JV raced next, and with Bobby Mosh calling the cadence and Big Stub McMillan in the engine room, Washington dominated again, winning by a staggering 8 lengths. As Joe and the sophomore varsity paddled to their starting position, they figured they pretty much had to win now, after what the boys in the JV had just done. Once they started, Washington leapt out to an early lead. Cal raised its rate and pulled even, then moved out in front by a half a length. Both boats settled in and held their positions for the next mile and a half. The blades of the two boats were dipping in and out of the water almost stroke for stroke. At the halfway point, California slowly increased its rate and stretched its lead out to a full length. George Morey, the Washington coxswain, called in for more. Ever so slowly, the boys began to claw their way back inch by inch. They whittled the lead down to a quarter of a length. Then they were bow to bow. Cal raised his stroke rate, but Washington remained steady and nosed out ahead. The boats surged into view of the fans at the finish line, up on the bridge. California started a sprint, charging forward again, back into the lead. The Cal fans erupted in cheers, but George Morey did not panic. He resisted the temptation to call for a higher stroke rate, knowing his boys still had plenty of power. Then, as the bridge loomed ahead, he leaned forward and called out, "Gimme 10 big ones!" The Washington boys dug hard. The boat leapt forward. At the end of the 10 strokes, the bows of the boats were dead even again. With the bridge and the finish line closing on them, Morey screamed again, "Give me 10 more!" Joe and Shorty and Roger and everyone with an oar in his hands threw everything they had into their last few pulls. The boats shot under the bridge side by side. On the bridge, pandemonium broke out. Someone called out that Washington won by 2 feet. The Washington fans roared. The loudspeaker boomed out. "Looks like California won by 2 feet." The Cal fans roared. Radio announcers hesitated and then beamed the news out to the nation. "California wins." The Washington fans on the bridge were furious, shouting and pointing angrily down at the water. Their boys had surged ahead at the end. Anyone could see that. The pandemonium increased. Then suddenly the loudspeaker crackled back to life. The judges announced officially that Washington won by 6 feet. A few days later, on April 18th, the city of Seattle held a parade for the victorious Washington crews. 80 members of the Washington Husky Marching Band led the procession up 2nd Avenue and Pike Street as confetti and scraps of paper mixed with a steady cold rain drifting down from the clouds high above. Al Ulbrichson and Tom Bowles rode with the mayor in a flower-bedecked cart. Then came the main attraction, a long logging truck draped in flowers and green foliage carrying the varsity crew and their shell. The boys wore white sweaters with big purple W's emblazoned on them, and each held a 12-foot-long oar upright. Joe knew Joyce was at work, so he scanned the faces in the crowd looking for his father or his half-siblings. They were nowhere to be seen. At the Washington Athletic Club, the boys were ushered into a smoky room packed with hundreds of Seattle's leading citizens. The boys from all 3 boats were called up onto a stage and introduced, one at a time, each to long, sustained applause. When it was Joe's turn, he stood for a moment, looking out over the scene before him. White light poured into the room from tall windows flanked by heavy velvet curtains. Enormous crystal chandeliers hung shimmering from high, ornately plastered ceilings. Wealthy men and women sat at tables spread with gleaming silverware and platters heaped with hot food. Waiters in white coats and black bow ties scurried among the tables, carrying trays with still more food. As Joe raised a hand to acknowledge the wave of applause, he found himself struggling desperately to keep back tears. He had never let himself dream of standing in a place like this, surrounded by people like these. He felt a sudden surge of something unfamiliar, a sense of pride that was deeper and more heartfelt than he had ever felt before. Now it was on to the national championships again, and then the next year maybe even Berlin. Everything finally seemed to be turning golden.